I'm gonna get going here. All right, it looks like we are rolling. So hello everybody and welcome to our info night on ADHD and autism. These two diagnoses are amongst the most common forms of neurodiversity, though this term encompasses a number of things such as dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, if I'm saying that right, epilepsy, OCD, and Tourette syndrome. You know, of course, one could argue that any non-normative functioning of the brain could be termed neurodivergence, but I have mainly seen this term used to refer to ADHD and autism. Ooh, I wonder how I get my captions on. Is it this button? This button? Ah, subtitles. There we go. Sorry, I forgot to do that before I got going. So I would like to talk to ADHD first, mostly because a lot of the terminology is similar for issues faced by autistic people and people with ADHD. So there have historically been three types of ADHD. There's inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. This terminology is now considered to be outdated, especially since the clinical understanding we have of ADHD only continues to grow. And with person first language and identity first language, it gets a little bit contentious depending on who you ask, especially when it comes to people discussing their own experiences and the academic community. So academics tend to use identity first language, and the logic behind this is to emphasize that a person with a disability is first and foremost a person, since people with disabilities have a long history of being dehumanized and discriminated against. Aristotle even had a couple of really iffy things to say about babies with disabilities. But many people in the disabled community use identity first language since their disability is a part of them, and they shouldn't need to de-emphasize it to make able-bodied people more comfortable. And since the majority of the people in the autistic community prefer identity first language, that's what I'll be using to talk about autism in particular. I tried to figure out what people in the ADHD community prefer to use, but I couldn't really find it. So I'm going to be using identity first just because word-wise it's a little bit less clunky. So executive functioning, is the ability that allows a person to see that a task needs doing, to prioritize the order of tasks, and then carry out the steps that need to be done to accomplish the task. Spoon theory, this is a favorite of mine. It was coined by Christine Miserandino, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and it's a way for disabled people to quantify their energy capacity in a way that able-bodied neurotypical people can understand. So fork theory, in contrast, is the tendency for tasks to suddenly seem to multiply for people with ADHD, and I'll show a video on that later that'll describe it a bit more eloquently than I'm able to. Masking is the ability some neurodivergent people have to, mask their neurodivergent traits. This can include making appropriate eye contact, not moving unnecessarily, forcing emotional inflection into their tone of voice, and overall appearing to be neurotypical, even though this can take a great toll on the neurodivergent person. Masking is done only to make neurotypicals think that neurodivergent people are quote unquote normal. I hate the word normal. I think it should be done away with. Nothing's normal. Like it's just a statistical norm. And it's just so that they won't be socially ostracized for acting quote unquote oddly. And then finally, stimming is the term for the ways that neurodivergent people meet their sensory needs. Everybody has sensory needs, and neurotypicals stim too. Like they just don't realize it. And it's way more stigmatized in people with ADHD and autistic people. Stimming can be so critical to maintaining sensory regulation by providing sensory input, such as certain songs that may help to regulate you, or repetitive motions that help a person feel more calm. So I'd like to share some statistics with you about ADHD. It is severely underdiagnosed, especially since the majority of research done on ADHD so far has been on young, able-bodied white boys and presents differently in different people. People with ADHD are also at a greater risk for learning difficulties, other mental health disorders such as anxiety or depression, self-esteem issues, substance abuse, and injuries due to risk-taking behaviors. And there's also a huge gendered and racial imbalance in diagnosis and experience, since ADHD is fundamentally a social disorder in the eyes of neurotypicals and people who are assigned female at birth, and Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color all have different social norms and expectations placed upon them. Some of the visible symptoms, next slide, there we go. Some of the visible symptoms of ADHD are inattention, fidgeting, short-term memory problems, and hyperfocusing. So for those of you who aren't 100% sure what hyperfocus is, it's when somebody with ADHD gets like super locked in on a task and they're unable to divert their attention to anything else. even to recognize that they need to eat or use the washroom, which gets pretty uncomfortable. People with ADHD also experience impulsivity, have difficulties remembering normal routines, have difficulties with transition times, issues with executive functioning, time blindness, and mood swings. So, what'd you notice? Feel free to turn your mic on, type it into the chat. There's something about that list of symptoms that I'm really wanting to point out here. And I can't see the chat, so if one of the other execs could keep an eye just in case somebody wants to type in there.
Nothing in the chat, and I didn't notice anything.
You didn't? Interesting. Okay.
I kind of noticed, just like with the mention of time blindness, that it's sort of similar to what a lot of people are feeling about COVID right now. But I'm not sure if that's what you were pointing out.
Not what I was pointing out, but that is definitely a good point. So, all of those symptoms are ways in which people with ADHD inconvenience neurotypicals, not the ways in which they're personally impacted by their own neurodivergence. So this just shows that historically, neurotypicals haven't cared one little bit about neurodivergent people and how they experience the world, only their own comfort. So even the diagnostic terms of ADHD are ableist, just inherently. So here are some of the ways that ADHD actually affects the people who have it. Rejection sensitive dysphoria, or RSD, is awful. In simple terms, it's an overly sensitized response due to a perceived rejection, and it's based on the experiences people with ADHD have had trying to decipher coded language used by neurotypicals and getting stung again and again by rejection when they're just trying to be themselves. RSD can also be a trauma response because being neurodivergent is inherently a little bit traumatizing due to the constant social rejection. So, when you got your report cards back and you mostly expected it, but people with ADHD often get, they're a good student if only they'd apply themselves, or they talk too much in class. And you don't realize that people are negatively talking about the way that you are being until you think about it later and oh, why did I do that? Why did I say that? And it turns into this whole snowball of anxiety and eventually becomes a conditioned response. People with ADHD also experience huge amounts of internalized ableism, social isolation, guilt, overt ableism from others, executive dysfunction, sensory challenges, and increased risk for body-focused repetitive behaviors such as skin picking or hair pulling. So there's way more to it than the diagnostic criteria or neurotypical people think that there is. So this is a good image I found online that I feel really captures what it's like to have ADHD. People are inconvenienced by fidgeting and inattention, but the actual experience of having ADHD is so much more debilitating than that. So there's poor impulse control, forgetting to eat, sleep, to go to the bathroom, choice paralysis, chronic unemployment, trouble regulating emotions. It is so much more than an attention deficit and hyperactivity. So I wanted to shift focus and talk about autism now. Some of the symptoms of autism include difficulties in communicating, sensory dysregulation, repetitive behaviors, and difficulties with social interaction and interpersonal relationships. And then some of the early signs of autism are periods of little to no speaking, delayed speech development, repetition in language or movement, atypical nonverbal communication, preference of solitary or parallel play, extreme distress about changes, and strong persistent interest in a specific topic or a toy. So once again, I'm gonna ask you to turn off your mic or write in the chat what you noticed about these lists of symptoms.
They're all things that are sort of visible to able or neurotypical people.
That is definitely part of it. What else do y'all think? And once again, I can't monitor the chat, so if something's in there, if somebody could
Nothing in the
let me
chat.
know, that'd be great. All right, thank you. So if you've noticed that it's, once again, the ways in which neurotypicals are inconvenienced by autistic people, you would be correct. There are a whole host of ways in which autism is hard for the autistic person, but clinically this often goes unrecognized through the persistent dehumanization of autistic people and the deprioritization of their needs. So some of the many related conditions that are often comorbid with autism include allergic sensitivities, autoimmune reactions, chronic constipation or diarrhea, varying pain thresholds to either extremely high or extremely low pain tolerance, low muscle tone, pica, which is eating objects that aren't food, seizures, sensory processing disorder, and sleep problems. So do you see how that earlier list of symptoms could be problematic when you factor in all of these comorbid conditions? So that list breaks down autism into the ways in which autistic people inconvenience neurotypicals and ways in which they're forced to conform to a neurotypical norm that their brain just simply won't do well in. So neurotypical people among us, do you ever notice how many metaphors and figure of speech you use? How you assume how somebody's feeling without asking them? How you forget to assume that not everybody who looks like you thinks like you and will formulate thoughts in the same process as you? Autistic people don't have the luxury of not noticing these things. Every conversation is a constant calculation of every minute gesture you make, every subtle glance, every change in the inflection of your tone, and yet you do all these things without thinking, right? So why do autistic people have to learn to conform to neurotypical society when many of the accommodations autistic people ask for, such as more clear step-by-step written instructions or less figures of speech, more lenience when it comes to things like eye contact, these are things that'll improve your lives too, right? Like accessibility isn't just making things easier for a select group of people. A more accessible world will benefit everybody. So I do want to touch on some of the many non-medical interventions that can be used to mitigate the impacts of autism. There are medications that can be used for symptom mitigation, but these ones are specifically directed towards autism. And I do have a point with this list, I promise, so just bear with me a moment, please. Activity-based intervention incorporates strategies into daily activities, looking at naturally occurring antecedents and consequences. Antecedents? I don't know how to say that word, my apologies. And then antecedent-based intervention looks at both interfering and on-task behaviors. Applied behavior analysis looks at behaviorism and selectively either reinforces or ignores behaviors based on the desired behavioral outcome. Assistive technologies help with communication or tasks, and there's as many assistive technologies out there as there are needs. Excuse me. Cognitive behavioral intervention helps people understand and change their thoughts and behaviors. So did you notice how clinical and othering the language I use there? I use that language very deliberately. It's very medical. So these therapies are often designed to try and change the behavior of the autistic person instead of accepting that they process the world in a non-neurotypical way. Many of the behaviors that neurotypicals want to change are ways in which autistic people are trying to survive a world that's confusing, figurative, too loud, too bright, and just fundamentally not built to accommodate people who fall outside the norm. There's a lot of ongoing debates and issues in and around the autistic community. I'd like to touch on some of the most recent ones I've noticed just by following the media. So the terminology of Asperger's syndrome, it's outdated. First of all, it's no longer recognized in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the most updated version. But it's named after Hans Asperger, who was a Nazi doctor and a firm supporter of eugenics, that's quite something if you know anything about, the Nazis' treatment of disabled people. He was one of the pioneers in the study of autism, which is good. We need research on these kinds of things. But he did also send many children to a Nazi clinic where they were experimented upon and ultimately cured in his quest to try and cure autism. And if you know anything about autism, you can't cure autism without killing the autistic person. So these children that were cured ended up being killed simply for the fact that they were autistic. Some people are arguing that you shouldn't erase history by no longer using his name, but others argue that his work went against everything that the autistic community has been fighting for so long. And functioning labels are also incredibly harmful, though clinicians and support workers tend to insist upon using them. And have you ever noticed that high functioning people are verbal, but low functioning people are nonverbal? Why do we prioritize being verbal so much when there are people who are selectively or semi-verbal, and then there are many different ways of communicating, like using assistive technology? And additionally, people who are labeled as being high functioning are often seen as having less support needs than people labeled as low functioning, when that's not true all the time, and it's not universal. Every autistic person is different because every human person is different. I touched on masking a little bit earlier in the presentation, but I'll just remind you of what it is in case you've forgotten. Masking is the ability some neurodivergent people have to force themselves to act like neurotypicals, and not everybody's able to do this. So there's been a pretty recent debate as to whether masking is a privilege, since only some neurodivergent people are able to do it, and you tend to face way more ableism if your neurodivergence is apparent. Excuse me. Some people argue that it is a privilege since it can be used as a survival tactic, just like some behavioral strategies used by people in the LGBTQ plus community to be less visibly queer can be used to keep them safe. But on the other hand, neurodivergent people who are able to mask and do it too often can get extremely burnt out, which is bad for their health for like a number of reasons. This debate is ongoing, and I personally don't have much of an opinion because I don't know enough to have an opinion. But it's something that a neurotypical person wouldn't really tend to think about until it's brought to their attention. And applied behavioral analysis is a really hot topic as well. It's one of the most common interventions used to try and help people with autism, help quote unquote. Although autistic people have been speaking up lately and saying that ABA does far more harm than good. It pathologizes a lot of the things autistic people do to regulate and try to function, such as stimming. Not only are autistic children punished for trying to regulate themselves, but they're forced to conform to neurotypical ideals of behavior. This also puts all of the responsibility to change onto the autistic person, and neurotypical people take none of this responsibility in this situation and in most of life because society is built for neurotypicals, right? So additionally, there is a huge consent issue when it comes to compliance-based therapy, since autistic children are being taught that their body doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the demands of others. The history of ABA is also pretty dicey. Electric shocks were often used to punish autistic children when they did something considered undesirable. ABA is also used in conversion therapy against members of the LGBTQ plus community, which just kind of reinforces the need to do away with ABA and find better ways to try and help autistic people learn how to cope with life in a neurotypical world. And if you've been keeping track of the news lately, you'd have seen that Sia, the singer, is making a movie about an autistic character, and she refused to hire an autistic character even though she faced huge community backlash. It's now come out that she's like showcasing very problematic techniques in this movie. It's an ongoing thing. It's been a whole mess in the autistic community. It's not good. Sia's not doing a good job. Now, she cited that she had worked with Autism Speaks, which is what made her behavior okay, but that's a whole other layer of problematic. This organization funds research that seeks to eliminate autism, which can't be done without systematically eliminating everybody who is autistic. Does that sound familiar? That's eugenics. All of the content they put out is focused around how autistic people are burdens, which, it isn't true. Autistic people are delightful. So remember, when Autism Speaks tells you to light it up blue, go red instead. Look for organizations that are mostly run and focused around run by autistic people and focused around helping autistic people get support and not by curing autism, because there's no such thing as a cure for autism. And finally, autism mommies. So there's a huge difference between people who have autistic children and autism mommies. This is the type of person to film their child's meltdown and post it on social media for attention. Which, that's pretty gross. They also complain about how their child is a burden or is trapped within their own mind and advocate for curing autism, which, if you remember, that's eugenics. So these children can't consent to having their lives posted on social media for millions of people to see, and they aren't in control of their meltdowns. And there's a huge difference between taking advantage of your autistic child and invading their privacy, and seeking support or venting in a healthy, non-invasive manner. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about autistic coded characters, since I think this is really neat. And many of the representations for autistic people that we have in the media are problematic and even pretty harmful. Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. That's really iffy, stereotypical, not good representation. Or the main character from The Good Doctor. These characters that I have here, they all have autistic traits, and they're accepted for who they are without being pathologized or discriminated against. Entrapta has been confirmed by the creators of She-Ra to be autistic, which is extra good because the vast majority of canon autistic representation is men. Additionally, if you're looking for good, accurate, nonverbal autism representation, check out the Pixar short film called Loop. It is delightful, it is heartwarming, it is beautiful. I love Loop, it's adorable. And I found a few videos for you here, each is under a minute. The creators here all have ADHD, and they often use their platforms to speak up about the struggles they and others face with ADHD. Let me know if the audio doesn't work. I thought I fixed this earlier, but if it doesn't, just let me know and I'll see what I can do.
Today we're going to talk about some pretty heavy stuff, so just know that going in. I have depression. One of the things that I find most frustrating is when parents reach out to me and they trivialize their child's ADHD. They'll grow out of it. They're just not applying themselves. Except, up to 40% of kids with ADHD experience anxiety and depression. Kids with ADHD are 10 times more likely to develop depression, especially if they are female. The rates of self-injury and self-harm are much higher in people with ADHD. Also, people with ADHD are far more likely to take their own lives. They also disproportionately suffer from sexual dysfunction, addiction, eating disorders, body dysmorphia. The alcoholism rates in the ADHD community are astronomical. All of this is fact. All of these numbers are from scientific studies. So parents, I am begging you, over and over and over again, science is showing us that ADHD is not trivial. It has a profound impact on your child's mental health. So please take your child seriously.
Right, and I got another one here for you.
Today we're going to talk about some pretty heavy.
There we go.
Part of the diagnostic
the
criteria of any mental health disorder is that it impedes your life in some sort of way. If you have symptoms, but it's not bothering you significantly, then you don't have a disorder. But what happens when you have a disorder since birth? How are you supposed to tell whether it's impeding your life when that is the only life that you've ever lived? Well, you rely on your teachers and your parents' evaluation of the situation. And often they aren't really evaluating whether it's impeding your life, they're evaluating whether it's impeding their life or everybody else's. And that's why little boys tend to get diagnosed with ADHD way sooner than little girls do, because their symptoms impact everybody else around them, because boys tend to have more externalizing symptoms. It's only when girls grow up and realize that not everybody is like this that they realize that their symptoms are actually impacting their life. We have no frame of reference. Part of the diagnostic.
So I got asked to repost my video about my fork theory and ADHD. But rather than repost, I thought I would add to it today because I have a little bit more to say. So my version of fork theory is based around Christine Mazzandorino's spoon theory, which you may have heard of. And if you don't know, spoon theory is a really good way to talk about managing chronic pain and chronic illness. The thought behind spoon theory is that everybody dealing with chronic illness or chronic pain has a certain number of spoons to use throughout the day. And when you do something, say shower, go to the grocery store, you take away a spoon. The problem that I had in my own life was that my ADHD never lets me stay on just one task. It turns it into multiple tasks. So I might go to shower, but then I might realize that I haven't cleaned the bathroom or I need to tidy up the counter. And suddenly 4 tasks turn into 16. And those tasks can start to pile up, making it feel like you're never going to get enough done. ADHD fork theory. And I want to be very clear. After posting my original video, I found out that fork theory already exists, like so does knife theory and spork theory. So all the silverware are taken. So I'm just going to keep calling it fork theory.
Yeah, so I thought you'd appreciate hearing about fork theory from someone who can put it a little bit more eloquently than I can.
So I got asked.
No, there we go. Sorry, still working with the whole technology thing. So here's some more resources for ADHD and autism. Much of the literature out there is directed towards the parents of neurodivergent children. So I wanted to provide resources specifically for adults who themselves are neurodivergent and are seeking help with managing life in a neurotypical world. The first 2 deal with ADHD, and the second 2 deal with autism. So that's all I have for you in the way of my presentation. Our next info night is going to be on February 25th. The next topics I'd like you to vote on are congenital heart disease, cancer, and encephalitis. You can use the QR code or the link to get to the survey to vote. Don't forget to specify if you want me to cover a specific type of cancer and drop some suggestions for other topics in the short answer box. I'll leave this up for a minute in case you want to do it now, or I can get Robin to send it out in a future email, so don't worry if you miss your chance, because you haven't really missed your chance. I also want to bring up some of the awareness days coming up. There's a whole bunch, but I'll point out a few. So Cervical Cancer Prevention Week is on January 18th to 24th. Holocaust Memorial Day is on January 28th. It's Children's Mental Health Week on February 1st to 7th. Black History Month is all of February. Eating Disorder Awareness Week is the first week in February, and International Epilepsy Day is on February 8th. Of course, it's never a bad day to bring awareness to issues of health and justice. Speak up, speak loudly, uplift people's voices, don't speak over them. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to John so that he can tell you about the charities we're supporting this time. And I'd be happy to take any questions once he's finished, or, feel free to send them in the chat so they stay fresh in your mind. All right, John, whenever you're ready.
That was great. So sorry, I'm just getting my my stuff up here.
All good.
Okay, let me just share my screen here then. Can you see anything?
Yep, looks like you're sharing the PowerPoint here.
Okay, is it full screen or is it my desktop?
It's full screen.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'd like to just very quickly talk about the two charities that we're going to be supporting this month. So the first one we're going to be looking at is the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, or AWN. So they focus mainly on providing support for underrepresented and marginalized genders, including autistic women, non-binary, transgender, and two-spirited people. They work on supporting autistic people financially, supporting them through education, community support, and publishing books that are related to autism. And they also have a fund specifically for people of color. I believe it's called the People of Color Fund on their website. If you're interested in donating to that. So they have two publications that you can look into if you're interested. They have one called Sincerely Your Autistic Child, and then one called All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism. And you can find out more about all of this stuff at awnnetwork.org. The next one, focusing more on ADHD, is the Center for ADHD Awareness Canada, or CADAC. It promotes ADHD awareness, education, and advocacy. It organizes research-based educational programs for people with ADHD and their families. It advocates to governments for greater support for those with ADHD. And it offers, there's lots of information on their site where you can learn more about ADHD, because as Kaylee said, it's very misunderstood by by atypical people. They have very useful infographics, educational documents, and educational documents for public consumption. And they have some online seminars, which you can go onto their website at cadac.ca and they can link you there. And yeah, so if you'd like to donate, you have two options. You could donate to us at IDEAA.ca. There's a donate button there, and you can select ADHD and autism, and the funds that we receive with that heading will be donated to both CADAC and AWN. Alternatively, if you just want to donate to one, or you don't want to, or you just want to donate to them directly, you can also donate through here. And there are the QR codes if anyone would like to scan them. Otherwise, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again for our next info night.
If you have any questions, please ask me. I will likely have an answer for you, and if I can't find an answer for you, I will either try to muddle it out or I can look it up and tell you later.
I had a question about some of the other diseases that are related to autism.
Yeah.
I remember allergies is one of them. There's some gut issues as well.
Yes. Yeah.
I was wondering if that is because of the whole gut-brain axis, and I've heard that the microbiome can be tied to that, but I was just wondering what you found to be the common factor of the relationship there.
So the research in that area is definitely still ongoing since there's so little that's known about how your microbiome affects your brain and vice versa. But I definitely know just from experience that a lot of autistic people have GI tract issues, gluten intolerances, allergies. Like it's pretty common to have food issues that go along with autism that go beyond just like sensory difficulties. So the jury's still kind of out on that one, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection that was more than just coincidence or comorbidity.
Right.
It's interesting. It's something I want to keep an eye on for sure.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's so much that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more like a comment than a question, but I found it interesting to learn sort of, well, interesting in a that's pretty terrible way, that so much of the like diagnostic criteria for ADHD and autism were focused on, not what the person not what the person experiences, but just sort of, if you're looking at them, what you can see. It just seems to focus, as you said, very little on their actual experiences. And as you said, like the treatments for it are mainly just, sort of making them, I guess, more compliant. Yeah.
So there's the diagnostic criteria for ADHD in the DSM are pretty like, do you have trouble sitting still? Do you often feel restless? Do you have troubles paying attention for long periods of time? Or do you like focus in for too long? Like it's so bland and boring. Like it doesn't even scratch the surface of what ADHD really is. And like autism, sure, in the diagnostic criteria, you get kind of like the main gist of what the big things are, but they don't go into the sensory processing disorder in the DSM, even though it says it's often linked, which is wild to me because I haven't met a single autistic person who does not have sensory issues. Or like all the gut stuff. To be fair, that is new research, but it's so common and so prevalent that I'm not sure why it's not listed as at least like a bit of a red flag when you're doing an assessment,
Right.
Yeah, it's quite something.
So when you say sensory issues, is that mainly referring to like sensory processing, or is that like?
So it is related to sensory processing, though I call it more of an issue because it's a bit more intrusive than just like a miscommunication. I'm not sure that I'm wording this right, but a lot of people with ADHD have sensory processing issues, specifically with auditory processing. So a lot of people with ADHD love subtitles. Subtitles are great because when you're looking at somebody who's speaking and their mouth is moving, it sounds like they're speaking Simlish from the Sims games. And then you say what, and they repeat themselves, but it's just that the processing takes a little bit longer, which is infuriating for everybody involved. Like you've all been there. You can't hear what somebody says and you just kind of laugh awkwardly and hope. Yeah. With a lot of people with ADHD, that's every conversation they ever have. But in autism, it tends to be more of a sensitivity, like a hypersensitivity or a hyposensitivity. Like I know a lot of autistic people have issues with introspection, so seeing what their body is telling them. So they don't know if they're tired or they're hungry, thirsty, but it's often in the form of sensory sensitivity. So like, you'll have an aversion to a certain fabric or a sound or a food or a texture just based on the fact that it's not a good feel. So, and it's not that it's just not a good feel, but the pain centers in their brain light up. So it's not just uncomfortable, it's physically painful to be experiencing these sensations. And an overload of these sensations is typically what contributes to an autistic person having a meltdown. So your brain just like shuts off, can't do it anymore, can't process anything anymore, just refuses to work until you're out of the overstimulating situation.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. What else you guys got for me? Well, there's no time limit on me answering questions. Feel free to email me whenever. I love getting emails. Please send me emails. I love answering questions.
Great job with your
Yeah.
presentation, by the way.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so well done.
Yeah. And it's always important to go right to neurodivergent people for your information. Because you've seen the clinical dehumanizing language that's often used. And I'm usually not this extremely social model in terms of disability. I think that there's, a medical and a social interplay that cause a disability to become apparent. But in the cases of ADHD and autism, you see how clinically misrepresented and mishandled it is. So it's important that people realize that it's more than just special interests and hyperactivity, Yeah.
Well, I can definitely see why that's an issue to have, why it's so important to have people who actually, sort of are experiencing these things answer your questions, because it's very easy to just sort of like type in, WebMD autism and then just read and accept whatever they say, even though it's just some,
it's just some guy.
It's just some guy who probably looked this up 5 minutes ago, putting it on there. Like, yeah, it's not, and it completely ignores the personal element and actually what the person is experiencing.
Yeah, especially because it's such a social, like, disorder, a social way in which it impacts your life. So everybody's impacted by it differently, even though you will have these shared experiences. Which is another element. Like, you can't treat every autistic person the same. You can't treat every person with ADHD the same. So you really just gotta ask your friends what they need. And if you slip up, just do better next time. Like, we could all be doing a little bit better, I think. Definitely speak for myself. Because all it really takes is kindness, right? Just a kindness and a willingness to do better. Yeah, that's my soapbox for the day.
That's quite good.
Yeah. Thanks, Kaylee.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah,
I had a good time putting this together.
Thank you so much.